Hello, everyone, and happy Martin Luther King Day. Thank you so much for joining us for this event, the Chicago Freedom Movement and the Radical King. My name is Lisa Yun Lee, and I'm the director of the National Public Housing Museum and the moderator for today's event. I am delighted to be working with our partner, the Elmhurst Art Museum, to bring together an enthralling group of activists, scholars, and artists to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a joy to introduce Nate Marshall, an award-winning author, editor, poet, playwright, performer, and a professor at Colorado College. Nate's work is an example of how poems can indeed change the world if we truly listen to the poem. His first book, Wild Hundreds, was honored with the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's Award for Poetry Book of the Year, and his most recent book, Finna, is a fierce lyrical masterpiece published by One World Press. Nate is an editor of the Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop, and he co-curates the Breakbeat Poets series for Haymarket Books. As a cultural activist and educator, Nate also co-wrote Chicago Public Schools' first literary arts curriculum that uses creative writing to help students engage in social justice, mental health issues, and community development. Nate also worked with me on the Everyday Objects from Public Housing exhibit, workshopping with public housing residents to write their own labels for their objects for our noteworthy exhibit. I was also lucky enough to first hear Nate as a young person when he won the Louder Than a Bomb Youth Poetry Festival in Chicago, and where he famously and correctly predicted that his career would be Langston Hughes. Please join me in welcoming my friend and one of my favorite poets, Nate Marshall.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to read two poems. This first poem is called Which Art, What Fact? Art Institute of Chicago, November 2016. Every day, I act permanent, a silly collection of carbon and oxygen and sometimes heart, and too often cruelty or callous or I just wasn't thinking. My bad. Each week I move around as if nobody will steal me. Again. Or my things. Again. And I ponder if which museum we end up in is a matter of power. Who hangs and who does the cutting? After all, what is science but a set of contemporary creation stories? What histories are natural and what artifacts art? How do we decide the borders of a country or an era or a solar system? When did we decide our planet meant only this collection of green? What I mean is this. Take this bowl the people used to mix and eat. What of the clothes the people wore to say, let us be one on this day of marriage? What of this staff the people made to love their gods? What of their gods, who are maybe our own with the names that lost, the prayers that got colonized away? In the section of the Museum for the Darker People, I make sense. In the Museum of Chicago, I have always been in the section for the darker people. And I presume once this president or the next wipes us up, perhaps our everyday particulars will be art. The Afro pick I push in the naps of my beard might one day have a name in a plastic box for preservation. Maybe the cheap dress shoes I spun in for my first high school homecoming will be a prime example of primitive garb for worship. Maybe my mother's coffee cup with lipstick kissed on its chipped face will be one of these art things in its next life. Oh, whatever God or whatever ancestor that wins in the next life, I pray, let me be an artifact of use. Let all my poems be bowls or thrones or hair pieces or marriages. Let everything I make, if it should survive, tell the next world mine were a people of faculty and faith. Let them know we were a race who prayed with our legs and sweat. Let them know that even when we are just art, we were here and we still are. And this next poem is called Fit 11. How much is owed to those who wore the chains, who tilled the land, who nursed the babes, who mixed the grits, who fried the food, who chopped the wood, who picked the bowls, who ran the road, who fought the war, who shared the crop, who made the name, who wore the noose, who blacked the codes, who sparked the schools, who juked the blues, who showed the soul, who left the South, who stayed the course, who caught the hell, who marched the march, who broke the strike, who struck the blow, who took the vote, who held the hood, who housed the club, who queered the notes, who spun the jams, who funked the flow, who built the thing, who built the thing, who built the thing. You know, take the payment you ain't give for all that and press it down, make it overflow, fit 11 times, and give me that in my own numbers of my own currency. Thank you so much.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce Mary Lou Finley to you all. Mary Lou has been an activist since the mid-1960s when she served on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s staff during his campaign in Chicago. Mary Lou has worked to help bend the arc of justice in the women's movements, environmental movements, peace movements, and more. She is a co-author of Doing Democracy, the MAP model for organizing social movements, and the co-editor of the Chicago Freedom Movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Activism in the North, which is such an important book filled with the contributions of an eminent team of scholars and activists who offer an alternative assessment of the Chicago Freedom Movement's impact on race relations and social justice, both in the city and across the nation. She is also a Kingian nonviolence trainer, conducting workshops and training on nonviolence for many years, and a sociologist and a professor emeritus at Antioch University, Seattle. I am so excited to hear some of her personal memories of her work with Dr. Martin Luther King and her thoughts about the lasting contributions of the Chicago Freedom Movement. Please join me in welcoming Mary Lou Finley.
So thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today, and welcome everyone. I want to just tell you a little bit about some experiences that I had back in the time when Martin Luther King was working in Chicago. I just graduated from college, and I ended up on Dr. King's staff, working on the west side of Chicago, 1965, 1966. And one of the things that happened was that Dr. King really wanted to live in the community with the people that we were organizing. We were dealing with many issues of under-resourced communities, what we would call them now. Poverty-stricken neighborhoods, bad landlords who didn't take care of the buildings when African American people moved in. A lot of low income issues. And he wanted to live right in the middle of all of that. And so some of the staff found him an apartment in the Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, which was close to where we were working. And he decided to move there. So the story, what I want to tell you, happened the first night he was there. It was January of 1966, and it was one of those really cold Chicago nights. And those of us who had been helping to set up the apartment, were worried that he didn't have enough blankets and that it was too cold. And so we asked if he wanted more blankets, and he said, yes, bring some more blankets and bring some barbecue. Because he wanted to have, he and Andrew Young were there, and Andy Young said Dr. King liked to have barbecue when he started in a movement. So a friend of mine from the staff and I showed up at this apartment with some dinner for Dr. King and the blankets they needed, and stayed around for a bit with them. And as we were there, there was a knock on the door, and this young man was there. And he said, he walked in, he came, Dr. King invited him in, and he said, "Are you really Martin Luther King?" He said, and Dr. King assured him that he was and invited him to come back and join the movement. A little while later, there was another knock on the door, and there was a whole troop of these young men kind of going down the stairs. Dr. King was up on the third floor of this apartment, and they all came in. And the young man who'd been there before said, "Well, I went back and told my buddies that Martin Luther King had moved in here, but they didn't believe me, so they wanted to come and see for themselves." So again, Dr. King was very in a jovial mood. He was very sweet and inviting to them, and really talked to them about how they could be part of the movement we were working in Chicago. The goal of which we called to end slums. It was a word in those days for under-resourced communities. And it was a sort of an amazing moment for me to see how much he cared about these young people. And I realized that because I had just been there that night, I was able to witness the beginning of his connection with them, which carried on through all of the work in Chicago. They came to see him many more times there and in other circumstances as well. And so, it was kind of a moment of, Dr. King had a big heart. He really cared about these young people and about their communities. And he really wanted something to change for them. And he wanted them to learn that they could do something about it. It was really a kind of amazing moment. And just to say a little more about what was going on in Chicago, we were focusing on organizing people in buildings around tenants' rights. Since that time, the laws have changed a lot. Largely, it came out of the Chicago work in some ways. But at that point, tenants didn't have any rights at all. And so we were connected very much with the housing issues. And we worked, it was a kind of multiracial organizing project. We worked with a white community in the uptown area of Chicago, where there were a lot of poor people who lived, and also in the Latino community. And so this Chicago work was a shift for Martin Luther King from working just around discrimination issues to beginning to do the multicultural, multiracial work that really he did for the next few years of his life, working around poverty issues. And he went on after that, I think to organize the Poor People's Campaign. We have now a contemporary Poor People's Campaign that harks back to his work in those days. Where he was really organizing people to confront the problem of poverty, and organizing people from all over the country, including Native Americans, including Latinos, and white people as well. What he did in 1968, the plan for that was to bring the poor people to Washington, D.C. and insist that the government address the question of poverty. As we know, he was assassinated just on the eve of that work. But the Chicago work was a really critical turning point for him in terms of really getting the country to face the issues of poverty. And one of the things he said at one point in that was, okay, it didn't really cost that much for the lunch counters to allow African Americans to sit there and eat their hamburgers. But if we're going to really address questions of poverty, it's going to cost billions of dollars, and we have to go there. So he talked a lot about economic justice, about what it would take to change the country so that everyone could either have a job or a decent income in some kind of way. So I really felt like this part of his work got its grounding in Chicago. And it was a joy to be able to be there as a part of that process. It was challenging. We only made some headway in it all, but it was an important step. And it was certainly a moment where he could talk about his commitment to the kinds of changes in the country that we would have to take in order that we no longer have hunger among our families in our communities, and that people can count on a decent income. He would be excited by some of the things happening today, I think, around like the $15 minimum wage, which is now we're talking about as a whole country. Um, so I'm excited to be able to share some of that with you. Um, and I wanted to say one of the things that he said in that last year, difficult as it may be, we must walk in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. Today, that's really relevant for us too. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with such amazing speakers, and thanks for all of your contributions. At the Elmhurst Art Museum, we focus on art, education, and architecture. In many ways, these are all present in our upcoming March exhibits, which reflect on both historical and contemporary responses to fair housing. This event launches our virtual programming for these shows, and I hope it gives a great introduction to important events of the 1960s as we reflect on them today. We started working on our exhibit on the Chicago Freedom Movement in 2019, a year before the murder of George Floyd and the history-altering protests that resulted. And we kept seeing echoes of the 1960s throughout the events of 2020. Unfortunately, as they say, history has a way of repeating itself. Today's calls for action against racial injustice continue the work of King and other civil rights leaders towards real progress of racial equity and inclusion. And as we said in a recent letter to our community, we at the museum have been inspired by the recent national conversation that brought more than 1,000 people to our doorstep to then march in Elmhurst Wilder Park in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We believe in our community and it's a commitment to diversity, though we also admit we still have more work to do. We started working on this exhibit after I met with the photographer and activist Bernie Kleine, whose activism has roots in Elmhurst. He was a pastor across the street from the museum at Immaculate Conception, and community members in Elmhurst raised money so that he could go to Selma to answer Dr. King's call for clergymen. He came back changed, led sympathy protests in Elmhurst, left the clergy, and dedicated his life to activism, later becoming the director of Hope Fair Housing Center for over 40 years. Kleine's photographs, which will be featured throughout our exhibit, documented multiple marches and protests he attended, as well as the environment of the mid to late 60s. Kleine continued marching and went to many of the Chicago Freedom Movement marches, co-led by Martin Luther King. Their national fights against systemic racism became concentrated through nonviolent efforts in the Chicagoland area. They fought against discrimination through issues such as unfair housing practices and the segregation it creates. As we'll show through our exhibit, this segregation was not just a city issue, it bled deeply into the suburbs too, and continues today. The show provides context for this through a variety of photographic works. It includes 32 powerful photos taken by Bernie Kleine, including rare color images of Martin Luther King. Maps and statistics that show trends, borders, and more from Hope Fair Housing Center, personal stories of the Chicago Freedom Movement and its legacy provided by some of our partners, such as the National Public Housing Museum and history makers. Soul-stirring quotes by change makers including Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and others, plus images of historic marches which help depict the ugliness and the graciousness of that time. And the exhibit will also feature a collaborative project between the Design Museum of Chicago, the museum's Teen Art Council, and York Community High School's Black Student Union. These groups will work together to produce a new photo-based project in which the teens will respond to quotes about fair housing from historic and contemporary activists and leaders. Their statement pieces on the ongoing issue of race in America will help remind viewers we still have a long way to go before we achieve what Dr. King and others fought for. In addition, we have an exciting, specially commissioned exhibit in the museum's historic McCormick House, which complements the In Focus show really well. There is Black Housing in the Future, Equitable Public Housing as Memorial, was created by Chicago-based Ayanna Moore and Pittsburgh-based Alicia Wormsley, and sponsored by the Goethe Institute. The exhibit's title is an expansion of Wormsley's ongoing project entitled There Are Black People in the Future. Their show is a means of activism and education to support mothers fighting for the future of Black housing. Beyond the exhibition, they've also created activist art kits for us to distribute. which will result in message-based signs, stickers, and even kites, as we look forward to seeing them spread around our community. We hope through both exhibits we can learn lessons for today and better prepare for our future by first learning about our history. We look forward to releasing more online programs and hope you'll come visit the exhibition after the museum reopens. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce Beverly Guy-Sheftall, the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center since 1981, and Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College. She is also a beautiful, brilliant force of nature. Professor Guy-Sheftall has been involved with the National Women's Studies movement since its inception, providing leadership and vision and pushing for the field to be ever more inclusive and expansive. She helped to establish the first women's studies major at a historically Black college. In her role as director of Spelman's Women's Center, she has also been involved with the development of student activism around misogynist images of Black women in hip-hop, as well as a broad range of social justice issues, including reproductive rights and violence against women. Beyond the Academy, she has been involved in a number of advocacy organizations, which include the National Black Women's Health Project, the National Council for Research on Women, on whose boards she has served. Guy-Sheftall has published numerous foundational texts within African American and women's studies, which include the first anthology on Black women's literature, Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature, and Words of Fire, an anthology of African American feminist thought. In 1983, she became founding editor of Sage, a scholarly journal on Black women, which was devoted exclusively to the experiences of women of African descent. She is also the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards. I've been so honored to organize and work with Beverly on various projects where she always brings a commitment to critical analysis, a passion for building community, and collective joy. Almost a decade ago, I heard her give a lecture about Coretta Scott King that was so luminescent, it illuminated the intersections between the civil rights movement, labor, economic rights, and gender justice for me and so many others who were lucky enough to hear it. I am thrilled that she is joining us to share her thoughts about the Radical King and the work of Coretta Scott King. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beverly Guy-Sheftall.
Okay, I'm Beverly Guy-Sheftall, teach women's studies and direct the Women's Center at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, the oldest historically Black college for women, which was founded in 1881. And it's an institution that the King family also has had a very close history with. Martin Luther King Jr.'s sister, Christine King Ferris, went to Spelman and also taught at Spelman, and his daughter, Bernice, went to Spelman. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is a Morehouse alum, as are his two sons. So the Atlanta University Center, Spelman College, and Morehouse have had a huge connection to the King family. I'm very thrilled to be talking about Coretta Scott King, and not in the way that she is usually talked about, which is primarily the wife of a famous icon in the world, Martin Luther King Jr., or the mother of the civil rights movement. I am very happy to talk about Coretta Scott King in her own right as a progressive civil rights activist and a comrade. This is the way I like to think of her, as a comrade with Martin Luther King Jr., in addition to being a partner or a spouse, and a person that I would like to argue had a radical progressive notion of the beloved community that included not just civil rights and race, but also women's rights, LGBTQ rights, peace activism, nuclear disarmament, and also anti-war, which we associate with Martin Luther King Jr. as well. I want to say a little bit about my own personal connection to Coretta Scott King, which I think is really, really important. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and actually Montgomery, Alabama, my mother's sister and their family lived in Montgomery. And so I went to Montgomery, Alabama to visit on a regular basis when I was young. And I attended Dexter Avenue Baptist Church when I went there in the summers, and grew up then hearing Martin Luther King Jr. preach at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and of course saw Coretta Scott King in that context. I also want to mention that my beloved cousin, Dr. Levi Watkins Jr., who ended up being a heart surgeon at Johns Hopkins University, was actually, and I've never seen this in any scholarship on Martin Luther King, Levi was among a small group of young African-American men who were sort of mentees for Martin Luther King Jr. And Levi developed a very close relationship with Coretta Scott King, which continued throughout Coretta Scott King's life, including after she moved to Atlanta, and he talked to her on a regular basis. So in addition to my scholarly, political, intellectual connection to Coretta Scott King, I feel as if I have a personal connection to Coretta Scott King, having known that family all of my life. My intellectual, scholarly involvement with Coretta Scott King happened sort of accidentally in many ways. Even though I had been working on and interested in rewriting the history of women in the civil rights movement, particularly the involvement of women in the Montgomery bus boycott under the auspices of the Women's Political Council, which is really the organization that was already planning a Montgomery bus boycott. I got involved in what I call deep investigation of Coretta Scott King when Ms. Magazine called me after her death and asked me if I could write a short piece about Coretta Scott King. I said, of course, yes. I thought this would be a very easy assignment. And when I started a deep dive into Coretta Scott King's life, going back to her growing up with a very particular family history in rural Alabama with her radical father, Obadiah Scott, this put me on a journey that I would not have anticipated. And it has resulted in that short piece for Ms., but it has resulted in a years-long exploration of the life of Coretta Scott King, which has resulted in a fairly lengthy scholarly essay in which I center Coretta Scott King as a major architect of an expanded, broadened, progressive notion of the beloved community, which also includes LGBTQ people, which was, I would argue, a very unusual aspect of Coretta Scott King's embrace of human rights. And I argue that Coretta Scott King was the first and most open, outspoken, and visible civil rights activist who embraced LGBTQ people as part of the concept of the beloved community. And it's that aspect of her human rights activism that has not been dealt with to the extent that it should. There's one scholarly text whose title I'm forgetting right now, which talks about Martin Luther King Jr. and issues around homosexuality. And that book really captures Coretta Scott King's serious advocacy and involvement in the LGBTQ movement. In fact, she believed that the civil rights and LGBTQ movements should be in concert with each other. And it was Coretta Scott King who, on the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, which of course we associate with Martin Luther King, and an out LGBTQ activist, Bayard Rustin, it was Coretta Scott King, and this was not a popular idea. It was Coretta Scott King on the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, who wanted it to be visible that March on Washington, the 20th anniversary, should also include LGBTQ activists. And the 40th anniversary of the March on Washington, which actually took place in 2003, was the most visible marriage, I would argue, if I could use that metaphor, between civil rights and LGBTQ rights. And that was as a result of the activism and the insistence of Coretta Scott King. She also wanted to celebrate Bayard Rustin at the 40th anniversary of the March on Washington, who, of course, was a major architect of the first March on Washington. So those are the kinds of aspects of Coretta Scott King's progressive political activism that all of the world needs to understand. I also wanted to, as many scholars have, disrupt this idea that Coretta Scott King was primarily important because she happened to have been married to Martin Luther King Jr. And the other aspect of my interest in Coretta Scott King has to do with her earlier life, the life before she met Martin Luther King, her life in Alabama with a progressive family. She experienced, for example, at age 15, the burning down of her home, and also the burning down of the factory that her father had founded. She experienced that at age 15. And this was because her father was considered to be radical and not knowing his place in that small rural Alabama town. So by the time she got to Antioch College, a very progressive radical institution, in 1945, because she comes from the class of 1949. By the time she got to Antioch College, which is also where her sister came, she was already progressive around issues of race. But it was at Antioch College that she became a peace activist. She joined the NAACP. She went to international peace conferences. And this is another aspect of Coretta Scott King that we don't know. She was vehemently opposed to, for example, the war in Vietnam. And even Andy Young credits Coretta Scott King with having an impact on Martin's evolving anti-war activism, particularly as it related to Vietnam. And Andy Young actually writes about Coretta's anti-war activism and the impact that it had on Martin's thinking. So what I'm saying is that Coretta didn't just support whatever it was that Martin thought about when he thought about the beloved community. She also urged him to think about the beloved community in very broad global human rights terms. With respect to women's rights, in a couple of articles and interviews that Coretta, that we're aware of since Coretta's death, she indicated that she talked to Martin about her notions of women's rights. And even though he did not himself, before he died at age 39, before what I call the strong aspect of the women's movement, Coretta is convinced and convinces me that if Martin had not died at age 39, she would have been able to convince him that he needed to also embrace women's rights in terms of his views of the beloved community. And I'll just mention one a personal anecdote that she writes about in her autobiography, which people may be surprised about. When Coretta and Martin got married in the early 50s, before the women's movement asked women to think about traditional marriage rituals, Coretta Scott King had the statement in the traditional Christian marriage rituals about obedience to husbands, asked that Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, rather traditional father, who married them, to scratch the obey from the marriage ritual. That will tell you that before the so-called women's rights movement, Coretta was already thinking about what it meant to transgress conventional gender norms. And the other thing that I will mention in that regard is Coretta always wanted to be referred to as Coretta Scott King. And if I'm remembering many times when she introduced herself, she would say Coretta Scott King, and she would actually put more emphasis on the Scott. And one of the reasons that she wanted to do that is she always wanted to honor and celebrate and remember her birth family. And she, in particular, I would say, wanted to call attention to the impact of her birth family on her progressive notions about race because of their particular experiences growing up in Alabama. So what I am saying is that Coretta Scott King was a comrade of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, but she was already a political activist when she met him. And she had a tremendous impact, I would argue, on his evolving notions about anti-war. And I would also say that if Martin had lived beyond the age of 39, and she believes this, Martin would have embraced her LGBTQ advocacy, would have allied with the LGBTQ movement, and he would have also embraced, despite his traditional upbringing as a Baptist minister, he would have embraced Coretta Scott King's notion of women's rights. So when we celebrate the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I would like for us to also celebrate the legacy of Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's comrade, and a person who would have broadened our notions of the beloved community and continue to be an architect of that very important concept, the beloved community. So that's what I would just say initially about Coretta Scott King, and hope that someone will do a definitive biography on Coretta Scott King and locate her, which is where I locate her. I locate her in the pantheon of Black feminist activists who understood the connection between racism and sexism and heterosexism. In other words, she also had an intersectional analysis of what it would mean to bring liberation in the US. And so I place her alongside Audre Lorde and Angela Davis and Alice Walker and June Jordan, which is not a space that I think most people would have imagined that Coretta Scott King could sit in. So thank you very much.
It is a pleasure to introduce my friend Bernardine Dohrn. Bernardine was the founding director of the Children and Family Justice Center at the Northwestern University School of Law. She is a child advocate who teaches, lectures, and writes about children's law, juvenile justice, the needs and rights of youth, and international human rights. I've also always known her as an international peace activist, always linking justice movements across boundaries and barriers. She is also a prolific writer, and some of her books include Race Course Against White Supremacy, written with Bill Ayers, and she is the author and co-editor of A Century of Juvenile Justice and Resisting Zero Tolerance, a handbook for parents, teachers, and students. She also continues to teach as a visiting professor. When I became the director of the National Public Housing Museum, she told me a beautiful story of when she was a young lawyer and was called to help with tenants' rights, organizing with Reverend King. And I asked her to share a memory from that period and help us to understand what from King's legacy might inspire and inform us in the continuing struggle for justice. Please join me in welcoming the amazing Bernardine Dohrn.
I volunteered to help work with Dr. Martin Luther King in the winter of 1965, when he and his team of organizers came north to Chicago to join in the struggles of local activists and organizers in East Garfield Park. I was a second-year law student at the University of Chicago. I thought to myself, I was not brave enough to go south during the past 5 years. If I don't step up now, I'll always regret it. Dr. King invited us to a staff retreat held at a camp just outside of Chicago. To be in such a place with legendary figures from the previous struggles and young people from the West Side was heady enough. At one point, Dr. King, who was just 36 years old at the time, turned to us and asked us to do the research to identify Chicago's most significant slumlords, owners of dilapidated and substandard housing on Chicago's West Side. We were thrilled and went back to the law school determined to succeed. We pored over housing data, consulted with law librarians, and selected faculty members, and could find almost nothing. Most buildings in that part of town were held in blind trusts, and names were hidden. When we returned to the next meeting, he called on me to report back. I was mortified to admit we had failed, and briefly explained the situation. Dr. King responded immediately, "Never mind, we'll call a citywide rent strike." The die was cast. I started regularly going to the church headquarters in West Garfield Park and never looked back. It was a brilliant organizing strategy. The people with the problems are the people with the solutions.
I am honored to introduce the Reverend Marshall Elijah Hatch, who has been the pastor of the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church located in the heart of Chicago's West Garfield community since 1993. Reverend Hatch holds a master's degree in government from Georgetown University, and he earned both a doctorate and a master's degree in ministry and theological studies from McCormick Theological Seminary, where he also teaches as an adjunct professor. In 1998, he was appointed a Merrill Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School. Reverend Hatch has led numerous community outreach programs, including efforts to secure affordable housing to Chicago's most marginalized neighborhoods. He has launched visitation and correspondence ministry for incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections and Cook County Jail, and he has worked against police violence, against gun violence, and also most recently been an outspoken advocate for public health and racial equity during the COVID pandemic. Reverend Hatch has decades of civic involvement as a member of the Chicago School Board Nominating Commission, as the National Director of Religious Affairs of the Rainbow Push Coalition, and chairs the Board of Trustees of Chicago State University, and also serves on the capital campaign of the National Public Housing Museum. Reverend Hatch is a proud native of the west side of Chicago, and he grew up with his family in the Jane Addams Homes. His family's oral histories are the foundation for one of the recreated apartments in the National Public Housing Museum. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Marshall Hatch.
Hello, I'm again Pastor Marshall Hatch, and just tremendous memories of what it felt like, especially when I lived in Jane Addams Public Housing in 1966 when Dr. King was here, and then 1968. I was a little boy, obviously, but hearing the name of Dr. King and that Dr. King was in Chicago. I remember one lady who I guess was a part of my dad's church, and as a kid, she said about Dr. King, well, everywhere he goes, he causes trouble. And really, he became one of my most important heroes as a boy. I remember when he was killed in 1968, I was 10 years old. And I remember the little flickering black and white television in our apartment at 835 South Ada there in Jane Addams Public Housing. And my dad shedding tears as we watched Dr. King's funeral. And I was 10 years old, and I looked up at my dad. And I think that, that was the beginning of this inspiration that I had in studying the life and the work and the ministry and the level of commitment of Dr. King, that prophetic ministry and social justice ministry that really is a direct inspiration, a direct relationship that I have right now, constantly being inspired every day by his work. And so I remember the riots of 1968, and my dad's church was in East Garfield Park, and we lived over in off Taylor Street in Ada. And I remember the riots on Roosevelt, where we lived, and then the riots on Madison, where the church was. And so it was just in many ways an inescapable call on my life that directly emanated from the from that season when Dr. King was in Chicago. And so there's really a host of us, who uh, came of age in the 1970s, impacted by the ministry of Dr. King, doors that were opened because of the nation's response to the assassination of Dr. King. Many of us were able to go to college and university because of that sense of obligation that the nation had for Black kids like me because of the assassination of Dr. King. And so it has probably been the most impactful life for me has been, the ministry of Dr. King. And so I often think about it, and I also am challenged always to be faithful when we see His witness. And every time I get a chance, I tell people that great things come from the West Side, and that even Dr. Martin Luther King at one time resided on the West Side and was a West Sider. So I'm very proud of that. And so I say, as we do every year around this time, happy birthday, Dr. King, and thank you for your witness and for your testimony. God bless you all. I'm often struck by the continuing relevance of the work of Dr. King, of the vision of Dr. King for beloved community. In fact, one of the last things that Dr. King shared with people was the stark choice that we have to choose between chaos and community. It would be either or. Either we'll learn to live together, Dr. King says, as brothers and sisters, or we'll perish as fools. And so many of us, our work is to choose community. And that means that, people have a right to a viable life, to the vision of public housing, for example, that everyone has a right to housing, and then public schools, that every child has a right to a high quality public education, and that zip code should not determine live options, and that everybody has a right to health care, to build the kind of perfecting of the Union, the perfecting of America. That is a vision that comes directly out of the life and the ministry of Dr. King. And so Dr. King is not just a historical figure, but Dr. King's vision and Dr. King's beloved community paradigm is something that we take into this 21st century, and probably more critical now than ever. It is clear to all of us that this wide disparity between the rich and the poor, that this income inequality, that this concentration of wealth will be politically and socially unstable. And so Dr. King's words, Dr. King's challenge is as important now than ever. We'll either learn to live together as neighbors, as brothers and sisters, or we'll perish in the chaos of dysfunction. And so we all need to really just not simply admire Dr. King, but be inspired by and challenged by the vision of Dr. King for this 21st century. And there's probably, in most of our lifetime, has been not a more critical time than this time, the time in which we live. And we've seen the results, if we continue in this direction, of income inequality, of structural racism, of literally demonizing and oppressing the poor. And so our challenge is to embrace community and at some point make sure that we invest into the least of these and those on the margins. And so I always say that, as a preacher, this is the good news, the gospel of God, right? That when the interests of those in the margins are brought to the center of public policy, that's when the kingdom of God arrives. And the last of first, and everybody flourishes. And I think that's the vision of Dr. King. That's the challenge of Dr. King. That's literally the challenge of the 21st century. So I intend to stay on the battlefield, as Dr. King and his colleagues would say, and keep on fighting the good fight and make sure that America is a land of opportunity for everybody. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to tell you today about an exhibit called Housing as a Human Right, the Hatch Family Apartment, that will be one of the recreated apartments in the National Public Housing Museum. Here is an adorable photo of Reverend Marshall Hatch as a small child with his sister in the Jane Addams Homes. The exhibit will be installed in the future site of the museum in the last remaining building of this historic WPA complex that was built in 1938 and named after Jane Addams, America's first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. This housing complex was home to tens of thousands of multiracial working-class people and included a library, a resource center, public health services, playgrounds, and a beautiful courtyard with these Edgar Miller animal sculptures that the museum is also in the process of restoring, interpreting, and bringing back home. The National Public Housing Museum was founded by public housing residents who had the vision to preserve this building in order for it to become a community and civic anchor with the mission to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where they can live and prosper, a place to call home. The largest object in our collection is the building itself, and the museum is a site of conscience. This means that we draw upon the power of place and memory, committed to connecting and linking history to contemporary social justice struggles in order to make the history of our site relevant to people's lives today, insisting that we cannot solve today's biggest problems without asking, what have we not yet learned from the past in order for us to create a collective future for us all? Along with the salvaged paint chips, the tiles, and other parts of the building that we have preserved, the museum also preserves the history of public housing by collecting the oral histories of residents from across the country, teaching public housing residents and youth oral history methodology to train a cultural workforce to create the world's largest archive of public housing stories. Too often, the stories of people of color, of women, of people living in poverty are not preserved nor valued. And the National Public Housing Museum serves as an example and a call to our nation to have a much more inclusive foundation for the stories we collect and preserve. As we began gathering the photos, artifacts, and oral histories of the Hatch family, we learned about Helen, their mother, who was so committed to education, she filled their apartment with books and encyclopedias, but did not want them to watch television. Until Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King came to Chicago, and the children were then allowed to bear witness to the organizing and activism that was taking place in Chicago during the Freedom Summer, working for open housing and economic justice. So when visitors come to the museum and go on a tour of the historic apartments that tell the history of public housing from 1937 to the present day, the Hatch family living room they enter, they will encounter bookshelves filled with encyclopedias, but also a family television playing scenes from the Chicago Freedom Summer. I want to also tell you that visitors will meet two live birds who were Hatch family pets named Martin and Luther. Images on the television will include these: scenes of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King on their couch at 1550 South Hamlin Street, images of their work helping to clean and address apartments that landlords had neglected, and also scenes of the vicious racist reactions of some Chicagoans who were against integrating neighborhoods and against open housing. They will learn about the historic march through Marquette Park in 1966, where he was confronted with violent mobs and hit in the head with a rock, where King later said that he had never seen mobs as hostile and hate-filled as he had seen in Chicago. When we see world historical events through the eyes of people like the Hatch family, we learn new things and begin to ask different questions about history. For example, when we were looking through the photos of the Hatch family celebrations, like this one from Reverend Hatch's birthday party, we noticed a striking similarity between the green paint in their kitchen and the green paint in public housing photos of apartments from across Chicago, and in fact, in public housing apartments from across the country. And as we listened to residents describe that green paint that was in their rooms and their homes, we researched and asked questions about that paint and learned about the work of Miss Hazel Johnson of Altgeld Gardens, whose husband had died of lead poisoning. And when she discovered that the green paint was toxic, she organized and fought to remediate buildings and demand better housing conditions, working with people like the young Barack Obama, leading a broad-based movement for public health and safety in the fight for environmental justice. This story will be told and discussed while visitors sit in the Hatch family kitchen. And we will connect this history with today's ongoing struggles against unsafe living conditions and public health dangers that too many people are still experiencing. The residents today, for example, at Altgeld, continue to work for sustainability and clean energy like solar panels in public housing, led by Miss Johnson's daughter, Cheryl Johnson. Stories like these are a valuable form of cultural capital and cultural power, and when we value the stories of public housing residents, it opens into an expansive universe of histories that inform and shapes all of our futures. On Martin Luther King Day, the National Public Housing Museum remembers and celebrates Reverend King and the activists who worked alongside, shoulder to shoulder with him. And we vow to continue the fight against the ravages of capitalism, racism, and war and imperialism, and work for peace and sustainability and justice for all. I invite everyone who wants to learn more about the museum's exhibits and our public programs to go to our website, www.nphm.org. And please take a moment to participate in all of our work and learn about our Power of Place campaign for the permanent site of the museum in the Jane Addams Homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their first-person accounts, poems, scholarship, and more. It's been an honor to present with all of you and to partner with the National Public Housing Museum today. I'm glad to have this opportunity to pause, reflect, and share more about the legacies of Martin Luther King, the Chicago Freedom Movement, and the continued fights for fair housing in the Chicagoland area. This event kicks off our virtual events at the Elmhurst Art Museum, and we will soon add more to our website before we can reopen our doors for the in-person exhibit. In addition to our show, we will create a resource center for citizen action and resources on fair housing, racism, and more. Look to our website for more in the coming weeks. Finally, thank you to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose work inspired all of us, and those who worked with him, and everyone that's continuing his work today. This world is a changed place because of you. Thank you to our partners, the National Public Housing Museum, and our sponsors, the JCS Arts, Health, and Education Fund of the DuPage Foundation.